Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. This is our webinar focusing on goal setting for both heads and boards. I'm David Madison, the Executive Director of the Southwestern Association of Episcopal Schools, and I'm joined today by our Director of Professional Development, Mary Catherine Duffy. Mary Catherine, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Thanks again for joining us. And as a quick reminder, we use the Q&A box as a way to communicate with the presenters, ask any questions, or if there's anything that you would like some additional information or clarification on. So let's take that Q&A box for a test drive. If you will click that and type in the city that you're joining us from, that will let us all know the Q&A box is working like it is supposed to. And those are starting to roll in. So again, welcome everybody. Thank you so much. And let's talk a little bit about the webinar today. So a few observations. When I think about goal setting for heads of school primarily, but also for boards, there are three observations that came to mind as I was putting together my thoughts for our time today. First is some of our schools aren't taking advantage of the relationship between the school's strategic plan and the annual goals for the head. In the ideal world, those two things should really be pretty closely aligned. And I'm not seeing that everywhere. A lot of our schools are, but some of our schools are missing an opportunity there. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on that. Also, some of our schools aren't taking advantage of doing a goal-centered evaluation process for the head. What I mean by that is some evaluation processes are more focused on what I would call essential expectations of the head of school and not really focused on the strategic things that the head has been tasked to do to move the school forward. Both of those things are important, but the idea of making sure that all of the evaluation process is really goal-centric, I think puts the school in a better strategic place than if they're only focusing on what I would call the essential expectations or the nuts and bolts of being a head of school. That's the second observation. The third observation is I think a lot of our schools are great at head of school evaluation. For some schools, that's a growth edge, but a lot of our schools do a really good job of that. I would say the majority of our schools are not doing as great of a job at board evaluation. What I mean by that is, just like the head should be involved in an annual process of evaluation, the board really should be involved in the annual process of self-reflection, self-evaluation as well. So that's an area I think that we're going to spend a little bit of time on today, and it's all related. I mean, the board needs to have goals, and its evaluation process needs to be goal-centered in the same way that a head of school needs to have goals, and her or his evaluation process should be goal-centered as well. Mary Catherine, any thoughts on that? Anything you'd like to add or share with the group on those 3 points?
Well, the only thing I would offer is that I was thinking as you were talking is that as we talk about setting up the goals for the head of school that are related to the strategic plan, then the head of school that can trickle down to faculty, and where you're ensuring that your faculty, it's all connected. And I don't think it just stops with the head of school. I think it continues on with the faculty because that completes the circle. But I really do. I agree with you that a lot of times we don't see a connection between the big picture of the strategic plan and how that funnels down into every area of who needs to be setting goals and what those goals need to be.
Agreed. Yeah, it really should not be, goal setting should not be something that's done in a vacuum. And that takes me to my next slide. Goals are really part of a larger picture. And I agree. I mean, in addition to the board and the head being aligned, I think that also goes down to the faculty as well, as Mary Catherine mentioned. But at the start, I'd like to just remind that goals are part of a larger picture. So this slide kind of takes 3 different slices that I think are all related. Obviously, at the highest level is the mission, the vision of the school. So that goes to the core of why does the school exist? How does it live its outcomes? That should be driving the entire enterprise, frankly. Then you have the strategic plan, which is an attempt to define what wild success looks like for the next time period, the next window. And then depending on who you talk to, there's a dynamic discussion about should that be a 5-year window, a 3-year window, a 1-year window? What's the appropriate window look like? And every school will answer that in its own way. But there needs to be something that goes beyond, in my opinion, just the 1-year view to a 2-year or a 3-year strategic plan. Then you have your annual goals, which is what the focus of our conversation today will be on, which is what are the tactical moves that we need to make this particular academic year so that we can make strategic progress on the strategic plan, which will also make us more effective at serving our mission and our vision. So that's how these all work. I get a little bit nervous if either the goals process is treated as a standalone one-off, or if the evaluation process is treated as a standalone one-off, because what that possibly demonstrates is a lack of understanding of how mission and vision fuels the strategic plan, which fuels the annual goals. So I wanted to start with just kind of that 30,000 or even 50,000 foot analysis before we get into the nuts and bolts. So let me ask this question. Does your school have a current strategic plan? So to me, that's an initial kind of consideration before we figure out, well, where do you go in writing your annual goals? So let me pose that question to see what the room thinks. Are you currently operating under a current strategic plan? You can either say, yes, we have one. No, we don't have one. Or it depends on what you mean by current. It's possible that you have a strategic plan right now, but maybe it's a couple years old, or maybe it's more than a couple years old. So that I think is an answer as well. So let's take a look at where everyone is on that. Mary Catherine, how do those results look?
Yeah, we've got 2 people, 40% of them say yes and 40% say no. And then we've got one, depends on what you mean.
Yeah, depends on what you mean by current. So maybe there's a great strategic plan, but it's 7 years old, or
Right.
Who knows. So let's do this. Let's take a look at both of those options. And then depending on where you are, my hope is I'll be able to provide you some next steps on where to go from here. So let's first work off the assumption that, yes, we've got an active current strategic plan, we'll say brand new. And what does that look like? Well, the upside is it actually looks pretty easy. What you would basically do is your strategic plan will have different strategic areas. Some strategic plans have 3, 4, 5 different focus areas that have been identified as an important area for us to work on in the next few years. And generally, each of those focus areas will have some type of outcome or success statement. So for example, in this model, we've chosen 2 different strategic areas that are the cornerstone of a school strategic plan. St. Swithin's is focusing on enrollment management and operational technology. In their last strategic plan, those were the 2 areas they wanted to focus on. And they define success in enrollment management as basically enjoying capacity enrollment, being full with mission appropriate families, while also meeting the national benchmarks for retention. That's what success looks like in their strategic plan for enrollment management. They also have identified operational technology as an area, and they define success as a school, our underlying technological infrastructure will support the needs of students in the 4th Industrial Revolution. That's kind of the language that we're using. It used to be schools of the future, but we're really kind of using that 4th Industrial Revolution language now because things are shifting so quickly with regard to technology and what our students are being expected to do when they go to college and then enter into the workforce. So that's straight from this school's strategic plan. Also, pretty much straight from the school strategic plan are the annual objectives. This is what we would call the head's annual goals. So these are the sub-projects that make up the vision statement for the strategic plan. So if we were to look at the entire strategic plan of this school, enrollment management would probably have 5, 6, 7, 8 different projects, or 5 or 6 different objectives. And so what's happened now is we've taken that and identified, okay, what are the 2 or the 1 that the head of school really needs to push forward to get us closer to that strategic plan vision statement, if that makes sense. So here, the two different projects that were identified was that rebuilding and maintaining enrollment at 400. That's capacity for the school. And then also enhancing the school's image in the community. Now, the next column, the action plan, that's more for the head of school. Sometimes this level of minutia is shared with the board, sometimes it's not. But what the action plan does is try to sketch out, okay, how are we going to rebuild and maintain enrollment at or near 400 students? It's a little more granular. For this, the next action plan was really to try to develop a data-based marketing process. And then for the annual goal of enhancing the school's image, it was developing a PR program. So this was a school that said we really need to come up with a systematic way of how are we marketing the place and how are we sharing our story with the rest of the community. As a second action item for that goal of enhancing the school's image, this school said we also want to develop key community partnerships. So what does that mean? Maybe key business leaders or employers in the area, maybe real estate agents, since whenever a family is moving into town, generally one of the first contacts they make is with the real estate agent. What's one of the first questions you ask the real estate agent if you have a family? Tell me about the schools. So having a relationship with key real estate folks could be an example of a community partnership that would help you serve that goal of enhancing the school's image in the community. Same type of process with that second strategic area, which is operational technology. And the goal that's going to push that area forward for this school is introducing a new student learning system or student information system. And then the action plan for the head is trying to research the different options and then trying to, once we've made a decision, what's planning look like and rolling this out to the faculty and to the community for next academic year. Then I've got some assessment. It's important that whatever your goals are, you have some way to assess those. Every action plan needs to be assessed. I've left a couple of those blank because I want everyone to understand that, you know, assessment looks different for every particular goal. And so that's going to, you're gonna have to do some work on that, if that makes sense. But for that first goal and action plan, maybe it's identifying a target number of inquiries. I don't like identifying an enrollment number as a target for a head of school, just because your head of school needs to have the flexibility to say admit or don't admit based on mission appropriateness. So I don't like tying a goal to an enrollment number so much as I like tying a goal to maybe an inquiry number or keeping it a little more vague. Mary Catherine, do you have opinions about that as a former head?
Well, yeah, I was actually thinking about, I like even further. Yeah, I mean, the number of inquiries is good, but so much of that is difficult to control. What I really like is maybe developing under the develop a database marketing process. You might have the assessment. I'm going to, you know, we're going to have a target number of open houses, or we're going to have a target number of visits to other schools, or something like that. That feels easier. I have seen we talk about this a lot with boards. The board will say, well, we want the head to have this many kids in the school. Well, that's hard. That's a hard thing to assess. It's a hard thing to control. But what you can control is how many times you go out and try to get people to come look at the school, or how many open houses you're having, or whatever. The other thing that I was going to note, and this may be an obvious thing, but when it comes to a strategic area like this and these annual objectives, I think it's important to note that, you know, even in a 3-year plan, there may be several objectives in a strategic area, and the annual objective is what year you're going to do that. And I think sometimes boards, they forget that they have 2 to 3, not every objective needs to be done in one day.
Right.
Or in 1 year. And I think people get really focused on, oh, we've got to do all of this. No, you can spread this out. This is that's when the 2 to 3 year plan, I think, is helpful,
Well,
because then you know what you're going to do each year.
and one way to help with that is making sure that a board doesn't just stop with creating a strategic plan, but that a board creates a strategic plan that also takes into consideration the financial planning necessary to
Right.
push the strategic plan forward. That's a
Right.
great way to kind of force tapping the brakes, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Because the other, trying to accomplish a 3-year plan in year one, everyone gets very excited. They want to get all that done. Absolutely. But there's two finite resources. There's the human capacity with the head of school and her or his team, and then also money
Right.
and the financial side of making all these things happen. For a lot of these projects, you're not going to be able to do them all at once because you can't afford to. So that's another way to really force the triage conversation, which a board has to have when you've got a list of really awesome, exciting things to accomplish in a strategic plan.
Right.
So again, feel free to ask questions as questions pop up, or if you need some clarification.
One of the thing on this that we have done when I was the head of school, one of the things we added to this is who's responsible, like a
Correct.
column that was who's responsible. And that was helpful, I think, when we looked at it as a board, because there are times where a board thinks that the head of school is responsible for everything. And there are going to be things on a strategic plan that are board driven and head driven. And it's important, I think, for a board more so than a head, because the head usually, in my situation, I felt like everything was my responsibility. It's good to see on the plan, everybody sees, oh no, those are the board goals. Yeah. These are the board goals and these are the head goals.
So if the board is identifying that step when they're going through the strategic planning process, obviously that will make the annual goal setting process that much easier for the head of school, because the head of school will be able to look at that entire strategic plan and basically look at the items that are responsible, that the head of school is responsible for, and that'll kind of thin that menu down as she or he is selecting their goals for the upcoming year. So the upside is, if you're in a school with a fresh strategic plan, then it's just a matter of being intentional of marrying the strategic plan with your annual goal setting, and then going to the next level, which is making sure your evaluation process is measuring you on the right things, which we'll talk about towards the end of the webinar today. So let's take a look now. What happens if you're between strategic plans? You have a strategic plan that is out of date. You can't find, there's no strategic plan from what you can tell that's been done, in this decade. So what do you do then? Well, I think this is a critically important time to have that understanding between strategy and essential expectations. Because what you don't want to do is say that in the absence of a strategic plan that's live, all we're going to focus on are the essential expectations of being ahead of school, and we're not going to do any strategic thinking because we don't have a strategic plan. I think that's dangerous, because even though you don't have a strategic plan currently in place, that doesn't mean that there's not a need for strategy. It doesn't mean that there's not a need for a board and a head to think strategically. What do we need to talk about this upcoming year? So, I'm getting a question here. Is there a resource for boards to assist them in developing goals? There is, Lori. Let's push forward, and then we'll circle back around, because I've got a couple of suggestions on that in the next slide or two. So let's keep pushing, and then we'll come back to that question to see if we answered it. Let's draw out what I mean by essential expectations. And these are just basically the job description type things that a head needs to do. We're not going to go through all these right now, but this is a list from ISM. And you can take a look at the head evaluation instrument that we have on the database in the document library. And there's a different kind of longer list of essential expectations. My point in showing these to you is that these really aren't strategic goals. I mean, these are just things that we expect the head to do. Manage to line 6, that's some ISM jargon regarding financial management of the school. Don't worry about the specifics of that, but basically making sure that you're managing the financial operations in a healthy way, consistent with your strategic financial plan. But my point is that These are not goals, in my opinion. I mean, these are things that a head has to do. These are things that should be in the evaluation process for a head of school, but nothing on these lists really qualify as strategic goals, in my opinion. These are
Yeah,
things that
I would just say too that I think sometimes I would argue that if this would need to be a goal, then we've got a bigger issue. These are things
agreed.
that we would expect, but for just on a general basis that we're doing as heads of school.
And they should certainly play a role in the evaluation process,
Right.
but nothing on either of these lists really qualify as strategic goals. Board Source is a great source for nonprofit board operations. Here's how Joyce Henderson talks about, the difference between strategy and goals as opposed to essential operations and goals. So many boards attempt to identify all the activities and behavior they expect the head to perform, rather than isolating the key results required for the success of the organization. That's what we're talking about. So the items on those previous two slides, important activities and behaviors you want, but nothing, in my opinion, on those lists really are isolating specific key results required for the success of the organization. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about goals. So what do? Let's say we have no strategic plan. What are some steps? And this goes back to Lori's question about how do you identify what those strategic goals may be? A couple things come to mind. First, I think this is an ideal time to do a SWOT analysis with your board. So what I mean by that is just having a board session where all you're going to do is talk about what are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that are facing our school right now. Strengths and weaknesses are more internal. So what do we do well? What do we do that we could possibly do better? Where are the growth edges for the school? Opportunities and threats are more outside looking, if that makes sense. So what's going on in the climate right now? What's going on in the economy? What's going on in the school world that could be an opportunity that we could seize upon? What are some things that are going on out there that could be a threat to us? Or there's some specific threats that are on the surface that we need to talk about? Kind of outside facing, if that makes sense. So, Lori, that's one thing a board can do, I think. I think if you do a really rich strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis, it will be pretty easy for some things to bubble to the surface that will be strategic goals that you need to focus on. If you're still struggling, another way to do that is to use the SAES Vital Signs document. This is in the document library on our website. The Vital Signs document are the common things that strong SAES schools share. So if you're still struggling with, well, what should our strategic goals be for the upcoming year? I'd recommend you download that document and then the board go through those vital sign points and identify, oh, wow, what's an area that we need to work on? For example, one of the vital signs talks about faculty salaries and benchmarking your faculty salaries compared to what the public schools in your area are paying. Based on that analysis and that conversation, that may be a goal you want to focus on. Administrative strength, the number of administrators and the administrative team you have in place, is that sufficient to achieve the program you want to achieve? Is your administration too lean? Is it maybe you've got a few extra administrators that need to be reassigned or responsibilities to be reallocated? That's another example of something that's in the vital signs. There's a bunch of financial indicators in the vital signs as well. So if a school is really struggling on where do we want to focus our strategic energy, if the SWOT analysis doesn't do it, or you're not sure if that gives you the clarification you need, take a look at the vital signs. There's great information there. And I can almost promise you, if you do one or both of those, a board won't have any problem identifying what the goals could be. The challenge then becomes, okay, we now have 12 things we've identified that are important. What are the 2 or 3 that we want to try to accomplish this year? So that tends to be the bigger push me, pull you conversation. MK, thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think they need to remember too, that as we're setting annual objectives from the strategic planning, and you may be touching on this, there may be additional objectives that you're setting that have to do with leadership and the way you lead the community or things like that. So again, having an appropriate number is really important, and having a reason, you know, what can we actually get done in this year needs to be asked, that question.
So, you know, let's say you go through that analysis, and then then a matter of identifying, yeah, what are the 2 or 3 you want to do? And then in this scenario that we're talking about, it's not going to be tied to a strategic plan because there is no current strategic plan. So don't worry about that. But just one more, you know, whatever you're picking with those 2 or 3, it needs to be a difference maker. It needs to be something that's going to absolutely push the ball forward. And if on that list of 7 or 8 that you come up with after the SWOT analysis or after the vital signs analysis, if you can't identify how that particular thing is going to push the needle in a dramatic way, then it may not be one of your goals for the upcoming year. So let's say you do that. Let's say you do the SWOT analysis or maybe you do the vital signs analysis. What does it look like to develop the head's annual goals? Well, same thing, basically. You know, rather than being able to pull data or text from a strategic plan, you're just going to have to draft that. So in this situation, St. Swithin's did the SWOT analysis and identified 3 goals that they want to focus on. One's financial, one's advancement, and then obviously strategic planning. So if you are in a situation where you do not have a strategic plan, I would say one of your goals needs to be beginning the process to launch a strategic plan. And then the same thing, you've got the annual goals and then the action steps next to that. So we'll just play with one of these. So one of the financial areas that was identified was just making sure that the financial process of the school is solid and that we're in the black. So they created 2 action steps for this goal, creating a 2-year balanced budget. This is a school that had never done a multi-year budget before. So they're going to start that process by doing a 2-year balanced budget this year. And then the other thing the school is going to do is, this is right from the vital signs, they're going to target having 120 days of cash on hand. And we don't need to get into the specifics of what we mean by that or how you calculate that, but that basically is just saying they're going to have enough liquid on hand to address any type of emergency that may present itself. Same basic type of process, a deadline, and then also making sure that they're measurable as well. So that's an example of what it's a very similar process. It's just you're going to have to do a little more of the first column work since you don't have a strategic plan from which to draw from. And again, strategies and goals, I think, are the cornerstone of a good, positive, rich evaluation process. So I want to share, I want to switch gears a little bit towards the evaluation step. And speaking of our vital signs, vital sign number 11 talks about the board having a constructive and fair process for ongoing evaluation of the head, but not just the head. As I mentioned when we started, making sure the board does self-evaluation as well every year, which is critically important. So let me ask another question. The question here is, does your school board use a head support and evaluation committee? So we're going to start by talking about the head, and let me launch that. So specifically with regard to the head evaluation, is there a head support and evaluation committee that your school uses? I've got yes, I've got no, and in some schools, when you really drill down, they have a head support and evaluation committee. They don't really call it that because they use the executive council or the officers of the board in that function. So that's why I have that third response there. And yeah, let's take a look at what everyone said. And a little bit, similar to our last question, a little bit of everything. So we've got some schools that have a head support and evaluation committee, some schools that don't have a head support and evaluation committee, and then some where the executive council serves in that role. So let's take a look at that. And I think I've got a comment for everyone, regardless of how you responded to that survey. So let's start with if you don't have a head support and evaluation committee. Let me go one step up and talk about what that is. So the head support and evaluation committee is exactly what it sounds like. It's a smaller subset whose job is to provide support for the head of school, make sure the head of school needs what she or he or gets what she or he needs in order to accomplish the goals for the year. And then also they're the group that oversees the evaluation process for the head of school. To the schools that are using the executive council in this function, I'm not saying that's a horrible idea. The one thing I would offer is someone may be selected to be an officer of a board because they have a skill set that, for example, makes them a great treasurer or makes them a great secretary. That might or might not be the skill set you need to do this type of work of providing support and evaluation to the head of school. To me, there's two reasons to not use the executive council in this role. One, they're busy enough as it is. They've got plenty on their plate. And two, they may not be the best suited to do this type of work. A potential third reason is you may want someone on that group who's not a member of the board. Or you may want someone who's a member of the board but not an officer. Why? Because they've got great background or great experience in this type of work. So to me, having a separate head support and evaluation committee makes a lot of sense because it allows you to do what you always want to do, which is match the talent of the board with the tasks that are before the board, if that makes sense. So
I agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I've seen it. I'm not saying that's a bad practice, and a lot of schools, I would say the default setting is to use the officers of the board. I just am not. I'm not sure if that's the best approach necessarily. I also
we actually did do that, David, at my school.
You did what, the officers?
We did the officers, but
yeah.
and it did work. But what I kind of like your point about. I think the head should have input in that committee too.
Like have one, they get to name somebody to. I think it's great. So. If you've got a former school head or someone with educational experience, I think that gets you better head of school buy-in if they're involved in the selection of that committee, in my opinion.
And so if it's not the executive board or the executive council, if it's somebody else, then the head's going to get have a little bit of input on who's on that committee. And that's such an important committee for, the evaluation part of the head support and evaluation is something we talk about all the time. But I think we don't talk enough about the support part. Right. And that support part is critical to a head's success. And knowing that you have a group that you can go to in need is really important.
I think so. And so that's a little bit about, let's keep going with this slide. So again, we're talking to kind of all three groups here. If you don't have a head support and evaluation committee, the first thing I would say is explore creating one. What that looks like is, and again, this ties directly into goal setting. It ties directly into the evaluation process as well, which is why we're kind of in a couple of different topics today because they're all interrelated in my opinion. But I think the first thing would be is once you create, that group, it normally is a task force or a committee of the board. I would suggest not using the board officers, but maybe, again, I don't think that's a bad practice. I just, for the ideas I've already highlighted, I like doing a separate group for that. But I think the first thing to do is to lock into that list of essential expectations. If you look at our head of school evaluation document, I would say those are the things that have the Likert rating, the Likert scale rating, like on a 1 to 10 or a 1 to 5, which really identify the essential jobs of being a head of school, if that makes sense. ISM has a list. We have a list. There's all sorts of lists. You can create your own if you want, but there needs to be an essential expectations list that you've locked into. The next thing would be for the head of school to draft 2 or 3 major objectives for consideration. And we've shown you what that can look like if you have a strategic plan And we've shown you what that can look like if you don't have a strategic plan. Once those items are drafted, then the summer seems to be a great time to bring this support committee together with the head of school, for the head of school, and say, okay, here are the 2 or 3 items I've really identified either from our strategic plan or in the lack of a strategic plan, that grew, the items I've identified as a result of our SWOT analysis or whatever that looked like. And in the summer, you lock into those. You lock into those 2 or 3 that the head and the committee believe are going to be the biggest game changers for us. At the first meeting of the board, either if the board does a retreat or at its first business meeting, that's when the board passes those as the head's goals. And then the final step is making sure that the committee meets periodically. And this is the biggest piece of advice I would say to both folks that have a head support evaluation committee or that have the officers as the head support and evaluation committee. The biggest recommendation I can give here is make sure they meet. They need to, this is not something that you meet at the start of the year and the end of the year. This group should meet. I mean, monthly, I think is not inappropriate. Maybe quarterly if the head's been, if it's an experienced, established head. I think also it just depends on what's going on in the life of the school right now. So we've got a lot of coronavirus activity going on right now. So I think this support committee may need to come together, a little more often to make sure the head's being supported, make sure the head, has the resources that he or she needs to be able to respond to that. Mary Catherine, when you were a head of school, how often did this committee meet for you? Do you recall?
Because it was the executive committee, that's the challenge with it being an executive committee is sometimes it feels like we met regularly, but a lot of times we were talking executive committee stuff rather than support. Now, a lot of times that can be gray, and there can be my meeting with the executive committee is supporting me, but I would say probably at least quarterly we met.
And I think that's another reason why I love having a separate committee other than the executive.
I agree.
Because I think just knowing heads and knowing how schools function, if it's the executive council, unfortunately, my concern is that the support of the head of school is not going to be priority 1. Not through any bad motive, but just because when a head of school, sometimes our heads aren't the best at taking care of themselves. That's why we need a head support and evaluation committee to make sure that, are you taking care of yourself? What do you need? Are you, what are the 3 things that we said we're really going to work on to make sure that we promote a high level of wellness for the head this year, et cetera, et cetera. So it just makes sure that it doesn't fall on the back burner when you have it as a separate group.
I agree.
So let's shift gears now. And I'd like to ask this question. We've talked a lot about head of school evaluation. What about board evaluation? So I'd love to ask now is, your school board, do they conduct an annual self-assessment or self-evaluation? Take a few more seconds and then we will. Okay, let's see how this looks. And this is about, I'm not surprised by this, about 80-20. So 80% of our schools say they're not doing an annual self-evaluation with their board and 20% are. I think that's probably a pretty good sampling of the association. What do you think, Mary Catherine?
I think so. I think that it's very common not to be doing that.
We've been working on this a lot so that we may have a few more, if we were to survey the entire group, we may have a few more that are doing this than the 20% of this sample group. I think we've got a few more, but maybe not. And again, this has been my experience. I work with boards, a lot of focus, a lot of energy on head of school evaluation. That's critically important. That's one of the most important things a board does. Not as much focus on a self-evaluation of the board. So let's talk about that. There's an example on our website. There are tons of examples out there. Do not think you have to use the example in our document library. But if you are starting from scratch, that's a great place to look. NAIS also has a whole bunch of different examples as well if you're an NAIS school. But what we would say if you were starting from scratch is 4 points I'd like to highlight. One, there needs to be some assessment about how is the board doing in achieving its goals as a whole. So in the same way we've talked about the head setting goals, has the board gone through that strategic plan and identified, here's what we need to focus on a board. So if we were playing with the idea of raising faculty salaries closer to the 85% mark of the local ISD, one board goal may be really related to what are we doing with regard to setting tuition? What are we doing with regard to fundraising to make sure we've got the resources to be able to hit that benchmark? That would be an example of a board goal. And there needs to be some type of assessment of how is the board doing as a whole in achieving its goals for the year. So how is the board doing corporately? That would be the essential expectations type of things that, that a board is responsible to do. Like if we had a job description of the board, those would be the things that would fall into that category. Just how are we as a corporate entity doing? And then how is the individual board member doing? So these are questions like attending meetings regularly, being prepared, being actively engaged in the conversations, supporting the school financially, supporting the school as an ambassador, et cetera, et cetera. Some type of self-assessment of the individual board member. Now, what's the follow-up process? The reason we do all this is not just so we can have another form to be filled out. 3 things I want to highlight there. There needs to be some process for systematically collecting this information. With SurveyMonkey right now as a free option, that's a great way to do it because it will tabulate all the results for you. An analysis, there needs to be some type of process for who's going to review this information. If you have a committee on trustees, this is a great thing for you to task the committee on trustees. If you don't have a committee on trustees, this may be something that the executive committee should do, but there needs to be some type of process for, okay, after we collect the data, what do we do specifically to read the data and to see where we're doing well and where the growth edges are. And then the third thing I'd like to highlight is this should inform your future board training and it should inform your future trustee selection. This information is critically important to identify, do we have the right people in the boardroom? And what do we need to train our board on? So if, for example, let's say you don't see the numbers you'd love to see on, I'm working hard to be an ambassador for the school in the community. Well, that could be an area that you want to do some board training on. Same if it's, annual fund participation with the board isn't 100%. Well, maybe that's a board training element. It's amazing how when you go through this process, all of a sudden you've got a really great idea on where do we want to focus our energy on board training and trustee selection as opposed to just general board training, which is great. And we do a lot of that and you need to do that. But it's also good to say, okay, based on our evaluation of our board, where are some areas that we really need to focus our energy? Okay, let me stop there and just throw it open to questions or if there are any points of clarification. MK, anything that comes to mind specifically on board self-evaluation?
I just think it's really important. Can y'all hear me? I've lost one of my headphones is out. I think it's really important that the board look at themselves. I worked with a board recently where we did kind of a matrix where they defined this idea around, you always talk about what's wild success look like. Well, on this board, they defined what do we want to assess ourselves about. And I thought that was a really good exercise actually, because it made them not just look at the instrument and take it, but it made them talk about the questions on the instrument and what
Right.
is it that we're asking that we really think we need to talk about. And they designed it themselves, which I think created some buy-in on the whole process.
Yeah, and it's a little bit labor intensive, but I would recommend that you create an instrument unique to your school.
I
Now,
agree.
I don't think you have to start from scratch. I think you start with, get 2 or 3 examples that are out there. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel, but there's something about the board creating their own instrument, I think, that does get you more buy-in, in the same way that a head of school should never be evaluated with an instrument that they've never seen before.
Exactly.
The call that I get that scares me the most is when I get a call about this time of year, generally later, from a board president that says, hey, do you have the head of school evaluation form? I think we need to do an evaluation, and is there, I can't find the form. It's great that they're reaching out. I love that they reach out, and we talk about that, and absolutely we'll show you where the form is. But what that shows is that you've kind of missed the point on the conversation throughout the year, starting with the setting of the goals that are aligned with the strategies that you've implemented, the regular meeting to make sure the head of school is supported, and then the evaluation instrument that every board member should be involved in. But it scares me to think that a head of school would be evaluated with an instrument that they've never seen until the evaluation process.
Right.
In the same way that a board creating its own instrument creates buy-in, I think creating the instrument for the head of school evaluation should also be a collaborative process. There should be some give and take on what is that list of essential expectations that I'm going to be measured on, as well as the annual goals that we're going to meet as well.
I agree with that.
So we've got a little bit of extra time, so we'll just we'll pause now and just see if there's any questions, any comments, any points of clarification as well for the remainder of our time today.
David, one thing I was just thinking about is that I think I've said this before, and I may have actually said it in the webinar that we talked about with the board, how the board supports the head, but I think it's perfectly appropriate as well to put in some personal goals, some definitely the goals that are going to move the school forward. But sometimes, and you alluded to this earlier about whether heads take care of themselves, I think there ought to be goals that you work with the head on that says, tell me how you're going to develop your leadership skills. Tell me how you're going to develop other areas that may, in fact, if they're not developed, impede your ability to move the school forward. And so, and I can think of a specific example in my own career where I had my board chair who had to say to me, hey, we see you doing too many things that are not on your job description, that are maybe more granular things that maybe other people could do, and that's not helping you. You're tired, you're exhausted, and you're not able to further the school. Right. And that was hard to hear, but really helpful actually, because I needed for them to say to me, hey, there are some things that that you need to be doing that further the school. And if you're too tired to do them because you're staying, you're working 12-hour days and you're working on the weekends, how about we set some goals for you personally where you have a little bit better time management, or you take the time that you're allotted to take, so that you're recharged and refreshed and you're able to then do the work that you're meant to do. Does that make sense?
Makes all the sense in the world. And I think that's one of the biggest gifts the board can give its head is perspective.
Right.
I think it's so critically important, because it's hard when you're the head of school, you're in the weeds so much.
Yes.
And it's really, and lots of heads of school, we use the throttle. The only thing we know to do is throttle up.
Right.
And that may or may not be what we need. We may need to let some things go and really focus our energy on something else. So it's a gift that the board really can help.
I agree.
With. Here's a comment. The challenge is encouraging the board leadership and the greater board to first educate themselves, and then second, embark on an action plan to move us toward these best practices. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the biggest challenges, in any kind of teaching, in any kind of development, is when, when there's not a perceived gap to overcome. So, right. Some boards are in a position where everything we're doing is great. Why would we want to do, everything we're doing is what we're supposed to be doing. It's working.
Right.
That's hard, because, the best thing to do there is to try to educate them on what other boards are doing. And there may be a little bit of a gap between what they're doing and what other strong boards are doing. And can we learn anything from that? And
Right.
that's open mindset, fixed mindset.
Yeah.
That's, and some communities and some boards are just in a really fixed mindset. And that's a hard challenge. It's a hard leadership challenge. You have to just kind of keep incrementally reminding them of best practices and then trying to gently highlight a potential gap between where they currently are and where they could be, with the payoff being so much more efficiency and so much more success. But that's a hard, any suggestions, MK, on how you do that? Because that's a hard thing to do, and it takes a ton of time.
Well, I like that you said gently. Was not always my strong suit. So gently is definitely, I think, important. And I also think that that it's a challenge when you're the head of school, you're trying to lead your board, because again, your board is the boss and you're
Right.
the employee. And so I think you begin maybe with cultivating that kind of spirit with between you and the board chair, because
Yeah.
the board chair is the leader of the board. And so if you can cultivate that mindset with your board chair, then they're the ones, and you can kind of get that going with the board chair, then the board chair gets it going with the executive team, and the executive board then leads the regular board. I think that's that can be helpful. But no, I agree, it does take time.
And, I'm thinking about, if a faculty member came up to you as the head of school and said, "Hey, are you being evaluated?" I mean, that wouldn't sit well. I suspect the head of school telling the board, "Hey, are you being evaluated?"
Right.
You know what I mean? I mean, it's a little bit of an
It's tricky.
interesting dynamic there. But what you can fall back on is you've got every independent school association in the country, and actually I'll go one step further, on the globe, saying that that's what strong boards do.
Right.
So the upside is, in that scenario, it's not the head of school telling the board they need to evaluate themselves. It's every expert in this industry around the globe saying that they need to self-evaluate themselves.
Well, even
So that
even
helps,
beyond this
hopefully.
industry, even into other nonprofit boards, nonprofits in general.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, board sources, I mean, even if you want to get out of the independent school education industry, then yeah, board source. I mean, the nonprofit world will be the first to say, this is something that you have to do.
Right.
So that makes it a little bit easier, but I don't think we'd be honest if we didn't identify that there's some interesting dynamics there.
Right.
And you use the best practices, use associations, use board source if it's a situation where you need to even step out of what the school associations are telling you and go one step higher to a group that works with nonprofits in every possible industry. And what I think you'll find is, wow, there's a whole lot of similarities between what school associations are saying and some of the best nonprofit associations on the globe are saying as well. So it's not just the head of school, saying that.
Yeah.
So last call for any other questions, any other comments. As we're wrapping up here, I just would remind you one more time, don't forget the document library. So the document library, it's a password protected site for SAES members. If you don't have your login credentials or need login credentials, make sure to call our office. Pat Blevins in our office will make sure you get those login credentials. But some of those documents that I referenced today are behind the password. Some, I believe, are not, but make sure you've got your login credentials. That's also how you access all the webinar recordings that we have to offer you. But don't forget those documents, the vital signs, critically important, the head of school evaluation instrument, the board self-evaluation instrument. All those resources are available to you, so you can kind of take a look at some of those other examples as well. So Mary Catherine, thank you so much for taking the time to visit with us today.
Yeah, it's been a great discussion. I like it.